Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're going to be talking about DR in the cloud for your databases. It's a great topic that we're really excited about here at Dbvisit. It's kind of the world of technology, the world of Oracle, the cloud, a whole bunch of things converging all at once. I'm Lawless. I'm the product manager here at Dbvisit. And I want to talk about our agenda first. And this agenda, it looks quite packed if you look at our agenda here. We'll talk about why the cloud. We'll talk about some of the current major players, how these players provide DR. We'll talk about DR in the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit about backups, and then we'll talk about setting it up and then cloud to cloud. So it looks packed, but some of them I'm just going to touch on briefly so we can get into the real topic of DR itself. So let's move on and talk about why the cloud. And there are dozens and dozens of reasons of why people would move to the cloud. And there's white papers, there's webinars, there's blogs, all sorts of things about why you should move to the cloud. And you may even have reasons why not to move to the cloud. But let's actually look at some of the reasons why people actually move to the cloud. The number one, some people say, is cost. Now, that can be an argument that's debated back and forth on the different costs. And we'll talk about that in a bit about this. Ease of use is a huge one. Is the whole idea of provisioning a database in seconds, in minutes, and having you just right up there and running is really amazing. And that whole idea is a great kind of push for the cloud. Not having to deal with hardware is another huge one, especially for smaller companies. Think about them buying a huge machine, but that they only need a small capacity. They also have to hire someone to run that machine, whether it be a contractor or that. So having that hardware in the cloud can be a cost savings right there, as well as ease of use. Concentrate on your business, not on having someone maintain that machine. And kind of related to that, this is always my headache in my former life as a DBA, is not hardware upgrades. Not only did I have to buy the hardware, then I have to worry about patching it and upgrading it and becoming obsolete. And new chipsets are out, and now we have better hardware in the future. So by putting it in the cloud, you kind of erase all of that. Another thing that I think is really cool is these pre-built images. There are dozens of pre-built images all over the different cloud providers, and you can get on those images, and they have all the all the software that you wanted. Boom, it's in an image. It's really great. And now we're starting to see bundles. It's not only an operating system, but it could be a database, and it could be an application on top of the database. So it's really neat. We've made some great use here at Dbvisit using pre-built images for our test drives, which we're pretty happy with. You can, fire up a database and our software, nothing to configure. It's already preset. And that last thing, speed of deployment. I think that 15 years ago, a QA department used to say, hey, I need a database to test. They would fill out a requisition form, and it would go through the process, and then lands on the DBA desk, and it goes in his queue, and then it's back and forth. It could take weeks, and some organizations months to get a box set up. With a cloud, you can press a button and have that box set up in like 5 minutes. It's really the whole idea of the speed, the ease of use of a cloud has taken off. So that's just some of the reasons why cloud has kind of moved to the forefront. And so what are the typical use cases? There's all sorts of use cases. Basically, any reason you have a box in-house, there could be a box up in the cloud. And I kind of put these in the order of what I call the life cycle. Many organizations are quite worried about joining the cloud or the cloud revolution or what have you. They're slow to adopt for a variety of reasons. So I call this like the progression. And the first thing you might do is put your backups to the cloud. The next step, you might put DR in the cloud. And then some of these are in tandem. You might put QA in at the same time, some development boxes. Those are the kind of the ones that are quite easy to do because they're not messing with production. But we're seeing more and more customers and people put their analytics in the cloud, their data warehouse in the cloud. It's a quick way to put all that data somewhere else in the cloud and run your analytics there rather than buy that hardware. So as new projects go in, they're kind of moving to the cloud first. And then even production. I can think of a dozen companies off the top of my head who do have their production in the cloud. They're quite happy. So it's not just for these backups and the DR, etc. There is production in the cloud. It does have its place. We hear the hype, but, there are companies absolutely doing that. And, when we talk about cloud, we have to talk about the different levels of cloud after we talk about use cases, of course. When we go into our next bit, we talk about, on my next slide here, that there are different clouds. And that's probably the number one thing that you need to think about is when people talk about cloud, not all clouds are the same. Not all clouds are equal. What does cloud mean to you? And is it just a box somewhere else? And I want you to think about that is, we're all used to having our PCs in front of us, our Macs, or our Windows, or Linux boxes. And that's local, right? But then when you turn that into your data center, if you're in an office here and your data center is across town, that's a box somewhere else. Now, what if it's not your data center? What if you're now connecting, let's say, from Europe to the United States? The data center could be in the United States. It could be at your data center. It could be hosted in another person's data center, or, dare I say, a cloud vendor. And what's the real difference there? There's not much difference. That's the key. It's a box somewhere else. Now, when we talk about your data center, you're managing it, you're dealing with it. Now, what if it's a box somewhere else, but someone else has to deal with that hardware? Now, that's kind of the beauty of the cloud, is you don't have to have that headache of the hardware. They worry about power. They worry about cooling. They worry about the variety of things that a data center has to worry about. And the next level deeper than that is a managed database. So not only do I have the box somewhere else, the database is installed, and then someone else manages the database. And I think that's where sometimes, as a DBA, we get a little like, whoa, I'm not going to manage the database? Who are these people? Many of them have standards, and they have certain things locked down. It's just the data back and forth. And of those, there's two types. Are you all by yourself on that machine? Or do you have noisy neighbors? Is it a multi-tenant machine with multiple customers on one hardware? So these are kind of the different levels of cloud that you need to think about, because not all clouds are the same. Many people do like to start off with a box that's someone else, it's just a box somewhere else. Or it's a box somewhere else, and the cloud provider handles the hardware portion, but I have all full access. You're like, just like a clean Linux box that you installed. It's just hosted by the provider. And that's where a lot of people like to start before they get into those managed services. And that's okay. Many people aren't used to giving up the control of the database themselves. So those are the different levels. And I just wanted to point that out, because when people talk about cloud, there are so many different things to talk about. So just think that there are different levels of boxes, there are different levels of service, and then we're going to talk about these major providers next. So, we talk about the current major players, and on my next slide, there's no surprises here. So globally, there's probably 4, I would call, major players. Amazon, often seen as the pioneer of these hosted services. Oracle Cloud, of course, is huge and growing. Microsoft Azure. It's quite interesting that, many of the Oracle databases that Microsoft hosts are on Linux. It always kind of an ironic smile. but Azure is a mature service. Lots of people love Azure. And then Google, Google's into everything. Google has a cloud provider. So these are kind of the four big heavyweights, and kind of the most well-known. But the next slide, I'm going to talk about regional providers. Don't shy away from regional providers. Regional providers can be very strong, especially in three areas. Pricing. Sometimes those big players can have an economy of scale, but regional players want your business. They can be flexible on pricing. Service. Oftentimes, smaller companies provide better service than the big ones. A phone number for someone to call, that type of thing. And then the next one I think is probably one of the stronger regions around legal, around regional players, is the legal compliance. Is many of those large corporations don't have data centers in your country, or they may, but if you're in a certain country and you have legal requirements where data can't physically leave the country, you probably can't play with some of those major providers. I think of a country like Russia, and there's a great cloud provider called Skyforce there. The data centers are in Moscow. The data stays in Moscow. You get all the cloud service you need, and it stays legally in the country. So depending on your level of legal compliance and what that data is, you may want to look to a regional player. And again, you'll get just as much service, as the big players. So it's just another aspect for you to think about when looking at cloud providers. And then the next point is the pricing. And I mentioned pricing earlier. Not all pricing is equal. You have to do some math. And when I started looking at a cloud provider for one of our customers, I made up two spreadsheets because you have to compare apples to apples. One company charged per hour and one charged per month. And when you start seeing pennies per hour, you're like, oh, that's so cheap. Just make sure you do the math, 24 hours in a day, 31 days in a month, and then you get the monthly pricing. But please read the fine print. Some charge extra for storage. Some charge extra for networking, for, uploads or downloads. And that can add quite a bit. And also make sure you're comparing apples to apples with number of CPU. Some call them vCPUs, OCPUs, CPUs. So just make sure, you are comparing A to A so that you can to find out what's the proper price. And then sizing. It is very hard to size in the beginning, I can tell you. The good news is about the cloud, you can start small, and oftentimes you can expand with it without any downtime. That's another great feature of the cloud. And I put down test. Before you jump in, of course you should test. I often think people don't test enough. And the last thing is about SLAs. Those SLAs are important. You need to make sure you read the fine print. They say cloud is always on, cloud's 24/7. That's not always true. There are some cloud providers that will put in there, Sunday at 4 a.m., we're going to have an hour downtime. Now, Sunday 4 a.m. where your cloud is, that might be Monday morning where you live. So just be prepared for that. Read the SLAs, see what kind of downtime they have or what guarantees they have, etc. So again, make sure you compare exactly the same for these different vendors. So how do these cloud providers provide DR? Which is a great question. And, one of the things that they lack is many of them don't have a hybrid solution. Meaning, many of the vendors, the cloud vendors we talk about, they have great DR solutions for when you're in the cloud, but they don't have a real solution for on-prem to the cloud. And that's a huge distinction. So if your database is in the cloud, they might have a fantastic, well-run DR for you once it's up there. But what if you're dipping your toes in the water? What if you're staying on premise and you just want your DR in the cloud? So many of them don't have that solution. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. They just have the cloud solution. So what are our solutions? Let's check them out. Backups. Many of these cloud providers have backups. Many of them have disk mirroring. Many of them use the database backup or database DR method. We'll talk about it. And then I put other, and that's a fun topic, the other one. So let's dig into each of them. So backups. Of the vendors I had talked about, they all usually provide a backup. Sometimes you can do a daily backup, a weekly backup. You can use the tool itself to back up. With Oracle, we're talking RMAN. Those are not really DR. And I'm going to get into that in about 5 minutes about how a backup is not DR. It's a great companion of DR, but it is not necessarily DR itself. So we'll get to that in a few minutes in some of the details. But many of these vendors do provide ways to back up your database. Next, mirroring. So mirroring is a solution that's been out there for quite some time, and it has its pros and cons. One of the major cons is that it is not database aware. A friend of mine likes to call him the zombie. It just, this block changed on the OS, I'm going to move it. The one thing is some of the vendors we talk about, they do have a cloud to cloud mirroring solution, which was great. But how do you get that from on-prem to cloud? There are some third-party products that can do that can use a data mirroring or a block copy, if you call it, from on-prem to cloud. But again, it's not database aware. As you can see in the picture, it's, an Oracle database, if you take a snapshot, it didn't get that change, that C on the slide there, because it only took the active. So, not to say it won't get up, but there are some limitations for mirroring in the fact that it doesn't know really what's going on at the database. And then after this, we have database methods. So when I say database methods, the database is on the cloud. So if you're using Enterprise Edition comes with Oracle Data Guard. Fantastic solution. And here's the cool part. On the left side of this slide, you could think of that as on-premise. There's your primary database. You're on-prem, and I want to have a DR in the cloud. Well, the right side could be the cloud, and you're using Data Guard. It's a native tool. It's database aware. And you can put that standby database in the cloud. Everything's fantastic. So many of the providers we talked about, it's just a database. You're using an operating system in the cloud. You create a database, and you're using Data Guard, a built-in tool of Oracle, to bring that right over there. And that's if you're using Enterprise Edition. What if you're using Standard Edition? I think most of the people here know what this slide is going to be. That's Dbvisit Standby. You can have a primary site, just like with Data Guard, and you can have a secondary site. And one of the things I found is many of our customers don't know you can have multiple targets. And, many of our customers will have a primary site in one data center. They'll have a secondary site, their standby database, in another data center. You could put a third one up in the cloud. And that's what I call the super cautious way of starting with the cloud is, you still have one on premise, but you can have a second or a third or a fourth standby in the cloud of your choice. So it's a great way to really, dip your toes in the water. So the Standard Edition Oracle, Dbvisit Standby could be your database solution. All right, and then other. So I put other. It's a really it's a neat topic, and I used Amazon here as an example. It could be with most of the other cloud vendors will have something like this. But when you buy your cloud component, if you will, you have these things called availability zones. And it's under the covers replication from one availability zone to the other. And what this means for an Amazon in this case, if an availability zone went down, they have a high-speed replication underneath the covers. They don't really talk about what it is. I believe it's some form of disk mirroring, but they don't really talk about it. It will automatically fail over to that other availability zone. So should be no loss of data, et cetera, et cetera. And so I call this like the inter-cloud replication. So again, this is cloud to cloud. You're already in the cloud. It's not a hybrid solution where it can bring you on-prem to the cloud. So that's just a little taste of what some of these vendors and the 4 different methods that DR is available in the cloud. Again, slightly different on-prem to cloud, or if it's cloud to cloud. All right, so how do we move our DR to the cloud? What if we're not ready to put our production in the cloud? How do we get the, starting with on-prem to the cloud? And this is what I would call, the hybrid solution. We have our primary site in your data center, in your location, whatever, your particular thing is, and you put your DR in the cloud. This is oftentimes people's first step to go to the cloud. It's actually a way to migrate to the cloud as well, which we can talk about. So, here, why do this? It's simple. It's a way to start with the cloud without all the hoopla and fanfare about getting to the cloud and getting comfortable and familiar with the cloud. Second is cost. Is many times when setting up a DR site, management often sees it as, another expense. Can we cut that expense? We're not really going to use DR. And what we found is often there's, after a natural disaster or something bad happens, we see a huge spike in the number of companies that are interested, whether it's a data failure or a power outage or a flood. We start seeing that, all right, DR is important. So just remember, DR should be built into your plan to start. So the cost is always very important. And that cost, if you can get the cost of a DR solution down, it makes it easier to sell. And this is where cloud can come in, is you can actually set up a very small database in the cloud and have your standby database in the cloud. And that's a great way to start at a low cost. I know many of the providers have quite reasonable numbers when looking at a small Oracle instance in the cloud to have as a DR site. Ease of use. When you start small, you can get a really simple package to put it up there. And as I said, it's a great way to dip your toe in the water. Get started with the cloud without really, getting overwhelmed with all the different things. It's a great way to learn. And geographical dispersion is, the more I talk to customers, I'm always asking about DR sites and what's your DR plan. And it's funny, I talked to one of a friend of mine, and he was talking about his DR site. He goes, I'm driving over our DR site today. I said, what do you mean? He goes, it's 6 kilometers away. I said, your DR site is 6 kilometers away? I said, if we have a problem, it's on a different power grid, he said, but a flood, snow, etc., all of those can affect you. So putting it in the cloud, many of these vendors will let you pick your location. So if I'm in Germany, I could put my DR in a cloud in Spain. So any weather or any power failure or anything like that in Germany is not going to be in Spain. So it's a great way to get geographical dispersion of your actual DR. So you get that almost kind of for free with your cloud vendor. So I promised I would get back to the topic of backups. So, we talked about putting our DR in the cloud. Many people want to talk about, on my next part, putting my backup in the cloud. So let me go to my next slide here. Hold on, it's sticking for a second. All right, so my backup in the cloud, I want to talk, the backup is not DR. So I have 2 points here is, backups are different. They're an integral part, but they're not true DR. Because if you think about what a backup, you can do backups every night. So if I do a backup at midnight and I have a failure at 8 in the morning, well, I could lose 8 hours worth of data, right? Because, my site's gone. So it's super important. Okay, say, all right, Chris, I'll back up every hour. You can, but that may now affect performance on your database. So they really can't match the RPOs and RTOs required for a DR site. So how is it different? Well, disaster recovery works in tandem with your backups. You can take a backup, and then your DR is going to be the incrementals for all of those log switches, all of those archive logs from that point forward. So I have after this, it's still important, and I want to cover it a little bit, but I have this picture here of the data center, and you're moving to the cloud here. So you can still make use of the cloud with, say, just backups. So I have a friend who he takes his RMAN backups, and then he moves them to Amazon S3, and he moves them there every day. So it's a way he's using the cloud, but it's just a way for him to store. He says it's saving him a ton of money. He calls it his tape in the sky. He no longer sends a tape off. He sends his RMAN backups up into the cloud. So I thought it was really neat that he did this. And then, I think it's been 6 months, a year ago, on the next slide, Oracle came out with something that is truly, I think, great. And it was the Oracle Database Backup Service. And it uses RMAN, so it's the tool we're all used to and know, and it automatically backs it up into an Oracle cloud. It's kind of seamless. It's easy. There's no thinking involved. It's all just an automatic backup. So again, backups are different, but I want to talk about, again, this is a way, if you want to start playing with the Oracle cloud in particular, here's a service is a kind of a good way to dip your toe in with Oracle using a tool that you already know and use, RMAN. So it's a neat thing to check out. And Oracle has some pretty good prices right now on this. All right. However, the next piece, again, I don't want to be a commercial for Oracle backup service, but on the next slide, I'll talk about, how do we go about setting this up ourselves? And, it's, here you go. It's back to this. On your primary, you put your DR in the cloud. You're going to set a database up in the cloud, and then you're just going to have those archive logs ship. Enterprise editions with DataGuard, you can use Dbvisit Standby for your standard edition. It's really that simple because you're just setting a box up in the sky. So there's our on-premise to cloud. It truly can be that simple. So how do I get started? And, we can prevent, I think I skipped a slide here. Oh, no, I didn't. Sorry. Prevent vendor lock-in. This is one of those things that once you choose a cloud provider, what happens if you want to switch cloud providers? So I go with vendor A, and they raise their price, or you don't like their service, or what have you. How do you get off of that machine? And migrations, as we all know, can be a huge, tricky, and especially if this is a managed service. How do you get off that? It can be quite tough. What you can do is maybe always have a standby database in another cloud vendor. So I'm with vendor A, and I like their service, and they're great. I can take a little bit of precaution, and I can set up a standby database on vendor B. And that can go on and on. And if for whatever reason, if vendor A is, not providing the service, or they raise their prices to an unbearable number, you can just do a switch over, and now you're on vendor B. It's a lot easier to do it that way, setting it up front, than it would be to do it in a rush when you want to get off vendor A. So it's a great way to prevent vendor lock-in. It's kind of a side benefit. It's cloud to cloud, but it's something to think about as you decide on your cloud vendor. All right, how do we get started? That's the important thing, right? We want to get started. So let's talk about the first step. You get to set a database up in the cloud. And it's funny that I put this first step here is, it truly is you have to get ready, set a database up in the cloud. You already have your one on-premise, set one up in the cloud. And then the next step is we're going to talk about, getting a backup. So I always like to start simple and start basic. You can start doing something in RMAN and do it yourself. Again, it's not DR per se, but it is a way to get started. You can do what my friend did and take your RMAN backups and then ship them to the cloud. Either write a script or use that Oracle services, kind of do it yourself. Next step is, after the do it yourself, is, the backup to the Oracle service. So you can use that Oracle service provider. Again, just getting yourself familiar with that cloud. After that, we can then talk about a standby database. If you're using Enterprise Edition, use Oracle DataGuard. Again, it's the same tool, same commands. You're just setting it up in a box somewhere on any one of the cloud providers. You'll make sure you have the same operating system as you do on your primary database. You set a database up, which was step one, on that operating system on the cloud, and set DataGuard up between them. And if you're not using Enterprise Edition, if you're using Standard Edition, you can use Dbvisit. Again, same steps. All right, so now what are the next steps? I always tell people, once you get that standby database in the cloud, test a switchover. Test a failover. And the important thing here, and this is the part where, it's easy for me to say, yeah, put your database, your DR in the cloud. There are some things you need to think about. What about your application? Can you easily point your application from on-premise to point it in the cloud? That also has to be tested. For some people, it could be simple as using a TNS name switch, or maybe you have a mid-tier server that you can point. But that also has to be tested and taken into consideration. It's not just the database. The application and the ancillary things around that database all need to be pointed to the cloud as well. And those should all be tested for latency, timings, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last bullet point there, I have 3 times because, as I said earlier, test, test, test. You really want to make sure that you have this bulletproof. It is DR. DR you want to make sure is bulletproof because in the event of disaster, you don't want to be panicked when there's a disaster. You just want it to work. You want to press that button or run that script and make sure it fails over and everything is good. So to talk a little bit more about next steps, I thought I'd throw some useful links, and I'll make sure that when we send out this, people can get these links. But some things I talked about RMAN, I didn't put a link because you can Google it. There's lots of things on RMAN on how to set it up. That Oracle backup service, I have a link. That link shows you step by step on how to set that up. Next one is Oracle DataGuard on the cloud, step by step on-prem to putting your DataGuard in the cloud. And then last, I put Dbvisit Standby. I have a demo there done by one of my coworkers. It's a great demo on step by step how to do an on-prem database and put it into the Oracle cloud. We also have examples about Azure and AWS and all that if you really need them, but the principles all remain the same using these links. So great way to get started with that. And then before I finish and take a few questions, my coworkers in marketing always tell me, make sure that you tell people about our blog, to like us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Our blog often has examples on how to set up on-prem to cloud or cloud to cloud or, migration. So we try to mix those up with content with how-to guides. So great way for you to also learn. And then also Dbvisit University. We do have classes that shows you, how to set up standby, how to perform the basic functionality and do all that testing, and you can become certified and become a Dbvisit standby certified person. So I want to thank you for your time, and I want to take questions at this point. And let me pull up the first question. As someone's typing, I can see. So the first one says, will vendors really give me a free test cloud? Absolutely. There are, many of the vendors will give you 30 days, or they'll give you a free box for a certain amount of time. They're usually small instances. If you're a larger company, you can often get, you talk to your vendor and say, hey, I need 2 months free things, but I can think of almost all the vendors that I've dealt with have all given some sort of free instance, free that. Next question is, what's a good way to compare costs of cloud solutions? That's a great question. It can be tricky. There are definitely ways in which, it can be what my friend calls high finance. When someone says monthly to hourly, make sure that you think about the different costs. And then it's not just the easy cost. It's kind of like buying a car. Again, I've never bought a car in Europe, but in the States, you see one price, and then there's the taxes and the fees and insurance and just all this other stuff. So make sure you compare everything, the compute, the CPU, the network. Make sure that all gets added up and you compare A to A. And that's the important part, is take your time. There are a few companies out there that are now providing a service for you to compare costs. Okay, another good question. It says, what about security and encryption? Security is kind of first and foremost on everyone's mind in the cloud. And I will say that the particular security is that's cloud's usually number one. People often cite that. In these vendors, it's their interest to make sure they're always on the highest patch. They're always on the latest deals with security. So from that matter, they're good. But, and I think this question's hinting at, what about moving the data from on-prem to the cloud? That's a great question. Is most of these products that I talked about, certainly with Dbvisit, we can encrypt the data and we can compress the data as it goes across the network. So you can be safe there as the data gets shifted. It says, what about a Dbvisit cloud provider in my area? This is a great thing. Location is important because of regulatory requirement. That is a great point. I mentioned this earlier, is think about, and for the person asking this, I will actually email you. We do have a partner in that area. Let's just say, like I mentioned in Russia has a requirement that certain personal data, my name, my address, my phone number, personal information, can't leave Russia. So if you're going to use a cloud, you have to have a cloud provider that has the data center in Russia itself. But China has some of these regulations. I know the EU has certain regulations about this. I know the United States does. So there are probably dozens of other companies with the same requirements. So these are the things you're going to want to make sure the data center that you pick is actually located physically in your country of choice. Otherwise, the major ones, they have drop-down lists, but regional ones can definitely do that as well. All right, next question that has legal questions. I think they were typing at the same time. So same as the last time. All right, and it looks like that's the last question. We're coming up with 2 minutes to spare, so I gladly made it just in time, under 45 minutes. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank people who are listening, who are going to be listening later. Certainly, if you have questions, you can email us. You can get in touch with your territory manager, or you can email us at info@dbvisit.com. Thank you for joining.